Welcome back, everyone. We're here for yet another one of our Benny Goodman sessions as we plow through this treasure trove of great 1935 Goodman known as the Rhythm Makers / Thesaurus sessions. I'm joined here by my two good friends from Searcy, Arkansas, drummer Hal Smith, and from the Mission area in San Francisco, Nick Rossi, plays the guitar and other instruments too. But the reason that they're joining me here is that the three of us share I play saxophone, not only an interest in our instruments, but in the period in general, and I've been playing and studying it for a long time. We just thought that we would get together, and I want to express my thanks to you two, because we really haven't done it here. This is a real time-intensive, kind of serious thing that we're doing while we're having a hell of a lot of fun. And so thank you for the time. It's much, much appreciated. Let's continue. The Goodman Band, June 6, 1935. They're in the midst of a marathon 51-tune record session being done not for commercial issue, for what they called transcriptions, which were recordings that were made exclusively for radio airplay. In this case, NBC Thesaurus was the name of the series, and they were played on NBC affiliates around the country, just under the pseudonym of the Rhythm Makers. Benny Goodman's name would never have been mentioned, but they give us a great glimpse into what the band would sound like on a night in a hotel or something like that. Maybe not on a one-nighter. I think they would have gone a little more wild and woolly on a one-nighter, but playing, especially where they were playing at the time, at the Hotel Roosevelt, where they had a huge flop taking the place of Guy Lombardo. This is probably what they trotted out there. It's absolutely fascinating on any number of levels. Let's begin with an up-tempo swinger. This is the Farewell Blues, as arranged by Spud Murphy. Now, Goodman would record 3 years later and change an arrangement by Jimmy Mundy, but this is the Spud Murphy Farewell Blues.
That's hot stuff. How nice. That could have gone the way that we heard something like Music Hall Rag go. Maybe too bright a tempo and no room to swing, but they made it swing. Yeah. And still plenty of breathing space. What lovely drumming. Early in the tune, we heard Gene Krupa play a little lick on the cowbell that came from Zutty Singleton, the New Orleans drummer. That's what Zutty would use to cue the end of one of his drum solos, or also to cue the out chorus of a song with whatever band he was playing with. And Gene most famously used that at the end of his solo on Sing, Sing, Sing. But it's just four little hits on the cowbell. it really woke everything up when he did that. I love the way he dug in as the song progressed, with mainly playing press rolls and a few cymbal crashes here and there, not playing anything fancy or complicated, but just keeping that dynamic pulse going all the way through. I heard something else not related to the drums that interested me. That arrangement, I think that may have been the one that Seeger Ellis and his choirs of brass used a couple of years after this was made in 1937.
Yes.
That was the band that was all brass except for Irving Fazzola on clarinet, and Nate Casbier was one of the trumpeters in that band. I recognized his solo style on that one just now. But I think that may be a Spud Murphy arrangement that Seeger Ellis played. It sounds very familiar to me.
You know, those are fascinating records, the Seeger Ellis 1937 things, and totally kind of overlooked in most big band histories. And he's such a fascinating figure. We should, we'll get to Seeger Ellis later. But okay. There's some collector at some point who sent me interviews with him and some background material. Famously, Louis Armstrong, I guess, made one of his very first studio sessions as a studio musician with Seeger Ellis, maybe with Eddie Lang, I'm not sure.
And Stan King on drums, yeah.
Yeah, in 1929. Fascinating. We'll have to check that out. Nick?
Sure. Well, we heard the kind of patented Alan Roos backbeat, although at this point in time in history, it wasn't the provenance of Alan Roos exclusively. You know, we talked a couple episodes ago about Lawrence Lucy, who had played with Fletcher Henderson in 1934 and other bands before then, but was playing contemporaneously with his Goodman band, with the Mills Blue Rhythm Band under the direction of Lucky Millinder. You know, Lucy was really known for his backbeat approach, emphasizing that 2 and 4. So much so that, you know, he later claimed that Benny hired someone that sounded like him, and we really hear that on this record. What I think is most interesting about its use on this up-tempo number, and it's often a device rhythm guitarists of this era will use on up-tempo numbers. Not only does it assure some degree of drive, but just from a physical standpoint, it's you can build momentum as a player by emphasizing the backbeat with the physical motion of your body. So a lot of times it's a survival technique of rhythm guitarists to get through a flag waver or an up-tempo number and, you know, really, really make sure that beat's driving. But what it also does is it really frees the drums up to do some more interesting figures. You know, sticking to that as he did throughout the entire song. I just heard Roos giving Gene Krupa a lot of space to do what Gene Krupa did. And again, you know, talking about this kind of this give and take within the rhythm section is another good example of acquiescing certain aspects of the beat so that someone else can either pick it up or emphasize elsewhere. So that was a great example of the Alan Roos backbeat.
I thought, you know, why don't we listen? There's a version from the Congress Hotel in early 1936. So it's you know, a little less than a year later. Jess Stacy's coming to the band. The band is still yet they're on the way up. Might make an interesting comparison. Man, I'll tell you something. I could, as much as I can think of it, like that last little trill at the end when Benny plays. It's also kind of like a funny moment, even on the thesaurus version. And I can just imagine, them having some fun with that, and Gene with those kind of like, drum hits. I mean, sometimes it's worth remembering. The great musicians have a lot of fun with the music, and they smile. They actually smile sometimes, and and have fun with it, not at it, but with it. And it's not hard to believe that Benny and Gene had fun with that arrangement too.
Oh, sure. And plus, they're back home in Chicago.
True,
that
too.
must have given them a fairly good feeling if they've had some rough spots in New York, and they're back in their hometown and able to let loose a little bit. Gene was certainly recalling his heritage from the Mackenzie and Condon records of the late 20s and the Red Nichols records that he made with the turnarounds on the tom-tom and the afterbeat rim shots behind Benny on that first chorus. He was obviously having a great time, and especially with that Chicago wipeout on the last chorus behind Benny, where he just went crazy while Benny was playing. That was wonderful.
What is a Chicago wipeout?
He was just basically playing a solo over Benny.
Right.
Snare drum solo. Marty Gross is the one who called that the Chicago wipeout.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Love it. Nick, anything from Mr. Roos there, or just the same driving?
Well, it's the same drive, but slightly different rhythmic emphasis. Not nearly as much backbeat, or at least not nearly as much that we could hear in the recording. The fidelity was a little more compromised in the thesaurus recording. But I was hearing more of a straight 4/4 through much of the tune. But the drive was still there, and again, there was still a lot of space for Gene to do his thing. Although I have a feeling Gene was going to make space, whether the rest of the section liked it or not.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get back to the thesaurus. To the thesaurus date. That was not easy to say fast. Let's get back to the thesaurus date, and we'll go to Pardon My Love. Okay. All right.
That was interesting. That was interesting. You know, I was kind of thrown back to some of those music hall recordings we were listening to. It almost sounded retrogressive by 6 months in a lot of ways, at times, kind of at its worst, if you'll pardon the phrase. But it also shows how much better of a band this band was than Benny's band of even 6 months prior. And perhaps more, how much more experience they had playing together. I mean, those passages are executed really, really well, which goes a long way towards the musicality. From a guitar standpoint, there is a lot to sink my teeth into from a rhythm perspective. You know, first and foremost, Roos is very clear on this. I don't know if it was a shift in positioning more as kind of a little more space in the arrangement, as well as Roos's attack and his approach. He was very forthright, I should say, in what he was playing. He also was voicing his chords a little higher up the neck, which means they're pitched higher, which is something that as Roos continues through the 30s, he's kind of known less for. I mentioned before how he eventually advocated not playing the highest string on the guitar. And I'm definitely hearing that on this particular side. A lot of some arpeggios that we've talked about recently in recent recordings, but then he also introduces this other figure that we've heard a little bit of, which is the introduction of some eighth notes in there, kind of tying these chords together. And again, this is a kind of a accompanist's a tool or approach. You know, you hear oftentimes on a lot of records where it's just a vocalist, where the guitar is providing the main chordal backing to a vocal. But other people used it. Like, I think I mentioned Frank Victor before, who was recording with Adrian Rollini around this time, and that seemed to be a favorite device of his. So other guitarists are definitely using it. And again, just something else that a rhythm guitar player or a guitar player in an orchestra like this would have in their toolbox and would bring out at the appropriate time for some texture, for a little bit of change from this song to the next, especially when you're there cutting 55 songs that afternoon and you're going to duplicate some tempos and some feels. You might as well spice it up a little bit where you can.
While we were listening to it, you were singing along, or, you know, some of the rhythms. Could you either do that again, or exactly, I mean, I'd like to get more specific on what you're talking about, because as the record was playing and you were going boom, 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 or I didn't quite hear it, so I assume, you know.
Oh.
Well, no. I'm saying you're inside what the guitar is doing in a way that it's beyond it for me. So what are you talking about? So we just tell our listeners, you know, the straight four would be just ching, 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 ching. What was he doing that was not just ching, 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 ching?
So we have the ching, 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 straight four, the boom, ching, boom, ching, which we heard a lot of in this particular record, which is that backbeat I've been talking about. And then it's kind of the boom, 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 boom. You know, people think of that as like the piano to heart and soul. It's kind of the most common use of that rhythmic figure. But that rhythmic figure is pretty common, or at least common enough on rhythm guitars during this period.
I see. Hal?
Gene Krupa was playing Chicago-style brushes on that one, and by that I mean straight, unaccented 4/4, like most of the drummers were playing. Once you're able to hear brushes on records from about 1926 on, when it's very clear what they're doing, and it keeps it from getting dance bandy. If the drums are playing tap, 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 as opposed to accenting the second and fourth beats. That's what you do with dance band brushes, accent the second and fourth beat. And I love the way that he locked in throughout the whole performance with Harry Goodman, yes. Especially when Harry went to 4/4 behind Benny. Yeah. Then both of them were just kind of pile driving the rhythm there. And Gene went to the hi-hat at the very end. That's the old school way to do it, as we've talked about before. You don't play it all the way through the tune. You save it up for the last chorus, just to give it a little added oomph. And that's exactly what he did there. So that was a wonderful, subtle, but very driving performance by Gene Krupa.
You know, I think the arrangement's by Spud Murphy, and in Russ's book he goes possible arrangement Oscar Levant, because in Benny's files back in those days, and when I got there in 1980, you know, they were still in the office in file cabinets just behind us there. And, you know, various people had been through them over the years, not too many, but a handful. And some people would just write little things. And Russ, in his earlier years, before I got there, I guess, was at the mercy of you know, whatever someone had written there. And I remember, you know, just seeing in, you know, with the kind of pen that I don't think they had in the 1930s or 40s, someone had written possible Oscar Levant. Maybe he wrote the tune. I'll have to look it up. But it has all the hallmarks of a Spud Murphy arrangement. Facets I particularly loved were the intricate harmonies on quarter notes. Sometimes at the bridge, we all noted that one moment where all of a sudden the rhythm section just goes ding, 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 ding. You know, some little motion, little, you know, subtle things like that throughout the arrangement. And again, just the blend of the rhythm section. Again, for people listening to it today, it's just, I think, well, first of all, you know, it's a certain population who's going to be this deep into this series watching this video, but nonetheless, it's kind of taken for granted. It's almost like in watching an old movie or something. Not sure what the analogy is there, but that, yeah, okay, boom, ching, boom, ching, boom, ching, you know, no. Placing those quarter notes where Harry Goodman was putting them, and exactly that sound and timbre of that rhythm guitar as they go note to note to note, you know, that's the equivalent of, you know, like, you know, a perfect landing of a jet or something. I mean, it's just, you know, absolutely perfect. So there we go. Wonderful, wonderful performance. Let's go to our next track, which is I Was Lucky. Oh, dee 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 dee. This is the kind of tune that's going to happen again. Every time I hear this tune, I can't get it out of my head for about a week. I don't know why. I mean, it's not that great a tune, but there's just something about it that gets stuck in there. Aren't you glad I told you that? Now,
yes.
Let's go to, okay. So this will be the second version, because we heard it earlier on. Here we go. Before we go any further, I just want to make a point here. Oscar Levant did not write Love Dropped In for Tea. I've already seen a few carrier pigeons outside my window of people sending over messages saying, who it was who wrote it. So, he didn't write it. Someone thought that maybe he arranged it. But let's get right back into it with what we just heard, which is I Was Lucky, which is the kind of tune, as I mentioned before, once I hear it, I can't get it out of my head. Interesting comparison with the Columbia record, no vocal here. Benny plays the vocal chorus. Interesting to hear him halfway through down low, and then he goes up high, then he goes back down low for a moment. And I imagine that it's just where it fits better for him. And of course, he's the kind of player that can play in any octave, in any key. Someone once described the clarinet. For those of you who don't play reed instruments, if you play a saxophone, you play from the bottom to the middle, and then from the middle up to the top with the exact same fingering. So a D is this, and a D is this, and an E down here, and an E up here. The clarinet is at least 3 different octaves with 3 different fingerings. This note down here is not the same note as when you play it an octave higher. So someone once famously described it as 3 people who never met. But anyway, just getting back to Benny's skills, Benny was that kind of musician who could, and Ken Poplawski's the same way. I have a funny story to tell you. I don't know if that we'll get in here, but could sight read anything, just read over a part, no matter how it was transposed, what clef it was in, what key it was in. Just an incredible player. And that all comes to mind when I hear him just messing around with octaves like that, where many players would be a little fatutzt with trying to do something like that. But getting back to this arrangement and that performance, so many wonderful little touches in it. And again, that rhythm section, just like a Rolls Royce. And I'd like to ask you guys, why do you think, the standard answer would be, well, Count Basie came along and changed the function of the rhythm section. But that's too facile an answer sometimes. Beyond just that, what happened to that kind of rhythm section? What happened to those kind of skills? Why did they largely disappear? Hal and I are closer to the same age, I think. Nick, I think you're a little younger. But, even we'll start with Hal. As you came up in the professional world, you knew some of the older musicians, I guess, who played back in those days. Did you ever talk about it, like why those techniques just kind of vanished?
No, I did talk to somebody who talked to George Wetling about it one time and asked him, you may have to edit this. He asked George, why don't you play all the rims and cowbells and all that great stuff you played on the Commodore records? And George Wetling said, well, I just don't play that horse shit anymore. But I'll tell you one thing, if I did play that horse shit, I'd play that horse shit better than anybody.
Okay, yeah.
So it was considered old-fashioned. And the only drummer I can think of who would play an older style at the drop of a hat until the very end was Gene Krupa. Even on his last recordings, you can hear press rolls and playing with left stick on the bass drum and syncopation between the tom-tom and the cowbell, sometimes the choke cymbal. And Dick Wellstood wrote about playing with the Gene Krupa Quartet. He said when he put his head down, it was back to Chicago in 1927. And you can hear that in Gene's playing right up until the end. And I can't say that about Wetling or Tuff or even Ray Baduke. The older players like Zooty Singleton played the way they played until the end, but younger players like Gene Krupa, they changed.
Yeah. I had the opportunity, I actually had the opportunity to work with Tommy Benford. And it was very interesting because he was playing in a club and Phil Schaap hired the band and Phil would announce him and he'd go into this great history. Here's a guy who played with Jelly Roll Morton and just all these things. Then he's on those some of the Benny Carter Django sessions, I believe, or in Europe in the mid-1930s. But Tommy, I'll say Mr. Benford, he could have been my grandfather in age, he had no interest in recapturing that or playing like that, any more than I think like someone would say, well, like why? And now I'm projecting onto him. I have no idea how he felt about it. I'm imagining that it might have been something like, well, I really don't want to drive a 1937 Ford. They look great in the old movies, but the truth is they were a pain in the ass to drive. You know what I mean? No power steering and maybe no windshield wipers. I don't know when they came in, the automatic windshield wipers. So that's interesting that Gene did keep that. And it's funny, even as his band, his band of 46 and 47 with Red Rodney and Charlie Kennedy and the Jerry Mulligan arrangements, he really made no attempt to change the way he played. It was a little bit smoother, a little bit lighter, but it was still Gene. And I guess he deserves a lot of credit for that. Yeah. When
there's the interview with Father Norman O'Connor, where he's asking Gene about his first recording session, and he says, "Oh my, yes, I remember that with Frank Teschmacher and Jimmy McPartland and Joe Sullivan," and you can tell how wound up he is remembering how much he liked that older style of music. And even Father O'Connor remarks on that as, "Oh, that must have made quite an impression on you." But he never let it go. That's one thing I love about Gene Krupa, is he always paid homage to his roots. No matter what the band was, what the musical setting was, he was true to his origins. I love that.
There's a famous, I think it's in his book, but in the Miles Davis autobiography, and or the question comes up somewhere in the Miles Davis legacy about, what was it like when Coltrane played this, or what was it like when Bill Evans played this, or what was it like when Herbie Hancock did this or did that? These incredible moments. Like, what was the biggest thrill you ever had? Was it when you heard this? He says, the biggest thrill I ever had was when Billy Eckstine's band came through St. Louis, and it was the first night he heard Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Art Blakey and whomever else was in that band. And it's almost analogous to, your first romance. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Assuming that it went well, but and I imagine with Gene somehow kept that what happened in 1927 with those musicians was something that probably could never be surpassed in terms of how he felt about it and how dynamic and new and fresh it was, and somehow he kept that going. Nick, I know we've gone a long way from I was lucky to be doing, but you want to take it back there, or just join in wherever the heck we are? Of course.
To provide some possible answers to your question about where did this all go. I think first and foremost, we can all agree the music changes over the course of the 30s to where it becomes much more, I don't want to say homogenized, because I think that's unfair to kind of, swing music at its peak in the late 30s and early 40s. But it definitely, there's a feel, there is an approach that is popular, and some of the big records share some of these characteristics. So I think some of it is the degree of popularity this music reached that made players kind of gravitate towards a certain feel, a certain approach. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, the bands were growing in size over the course of the 1930s. So as you're adding extra chairs to the band, my ears suggest that there's a little less room for rhythmic subtlety, if you will. And it's something I talked about earlier. One of the big challenges musicians in the rhythm section faced at this time was volume, particularly in the bass and the guitar chair. These are parlor instruments. These are chamber instruments to some extent. If you saw a bass in an orchestra, there would be several basses playing together to create a big sound. But you've got one bass, except in the instance of Duke Ellington's band in the late 30s, where you have two bass players. But you have one bass, you have a guitar. The first step was to make the guitar bigger, physically bigger, to make it louder. Eventually, it would be amplified, which solved the problem of volume, but instantly took away from the timbre of the instrument, part of what it contributed to the overall feel of the band. So you have the bass player and the guitar player battling volume, and you have some real innovations in those instruments by the late 30s. I mean, the arrival of Jimmy Blanton with Ellington's band at the very end of the decade and the beginning of the 40s truly changed bass playing in terms of it was such a big innovation at the time. And, you know, this is not to say that Blanton was not a subtle bass player, but he was subtle in different ways than we were hearing on these older records with these kind of shifting rhythmic tendencies. So I think between the changes of the music to the popularity, the changes of the size of the band, the way the arrangers were writing for these bands, you know, you compare Eddie Durham's arrangements for Basie in the late 30s with Jimmy Mundy's arrangements for Basie in the early 40s, and there's just less space. I would characterize it from a very basic perspective, and I realize someone could to argue with me till they're blue in the face about the concept, but there's just kind of more there in these Mundy charts, more on the page, less kind of up to the rhythm section to conjure. And, you know, again, everyone points to the innovations of the Basie rhythm section, and they were tremendously innovative and fantastic, one of the best of all time. But, you know, the Basie rhythm section on the 37 records is different than the one on the 39 records, is different on the one on the 1940 records, 1945. That, you know, that same section, even though it usually had the same players, changed their approach slightly through the course of history, somewhat in reactive to some of these factors I was talking about, somewhat in reactive to the arrangements that the band was playing. And also, I think to the notion that we've talked about and other people have talked about, which is, you know, this music is just progressing. We're listening to a snapshot of a time and a place, but the music continues to progress throughout 1935, throughout 1936. And these musicians are adapting and not only driving progress, but reacting to progress. So I think there's a lot going on that changed the complexion of the rhythm section.
I have to say, I have a sensitivity to a word you used, and we should talk about it. It's the word "of." No, I'm kidding. No, it's the word progress.
Right.
Progress as opposed to evolution, but even evolution is, you know, these are weighted words, as we all know, and of course we all understand exactly what you mean, and they did change. But sometimes people use those adjectives with another agenda to infer that somehow, and look who I'm talking to here. I'm talking to Hal and Nick and Loren here. So look who's talking, you know. But what I mean is that I mean I'm preaching to the choir, but here I go anyway. That with a lot of my students, you know, anything before John Coltrane or Charlie Parker is some version of Mel Brooks's 2,000-year-old man. You know what I mean? I mean, it's just they were Neanderthal. You know, I mean, they were just forget it. You know, he was a sweetie. You know, all this kind of stuff. And so I know that you know that, and I'm not telling you that, but so that's why I just flagged the word progressing or whatever. Mm-hmm. They were changing. And is that too subtle a distinction?
No, I think it's an important thing to talk about because, you know, it's no secret. I mean, I spend most of my performance life as a jazz musician playing in older styles.
Aren't all jazz styles older styles?
Well, you know.
I mean, you're
really opening up the
well, no, I'm just saying. I mean, I'm just saying. You know, you go into, if you could go into the Village Vanguard in New York, or Yoshi's in San Francisco, or wherever Hal would go in a jazz club near him, in Memphis or in any place, you'll hear people playing music from the 1960s,
right?
And it's thought somehow to be contemporary. Mm-hmm. Something that you might have heard on a record in 1967 with Chick Corea, or 1977 and Herbie Hancock and whoever else. And yet, the jazz styles that we're talking about are called older.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty much all older, unless you're talking about, a very select group of artists who really do something you can tell from listening. No, it's not 1990. It's not 2000. It's not 2010. So it's just it's kind of interesting.
Well, I think to your point, there's an unsatisfying term for the development of jazz during this period. What is it? Just historic development? Because we're looking at it all retrospectively. We're looking at it all from a historic standpoint at this point in time. So, I suppose at the time, and I've seen this word used in contemporary accounts of things of progress being made, of things being progressive.
Sure,
and of course,
sure.
That word gets bandied about a lot in the 1940s for a lot of different types of music in the kind of modern jazz, under the modern jazz umbrella. But, you already hear it.
Famously including Can't Stand Him in his orchestra. I'm sorry, Stan Kenton in his orchestra. Anyway, okay. But no, it's true.
Nothing stops conversation like Stan Kenton.
Right.
I think once the timekeeping in the drum set went from the snare drum to the hi-hat and the ride cymbal, there's no looking back, basically. That's the biggest change to me. And also not relying necessarily on playing 4/4 on the bass drum, being able to drop bombs as they would do in the mid-40s on. But once that all changed, that changed the whole complexion of the rhythm section. You see some bands dispense with the rhythm guitar, which is a terrible idea. That should never happen. You see the bassist.
Checks in the mail. Checks in the mail.
I can use it. But once that development happened, the bass is playing a different way, not playing the older way that even Harry Goodman is doing here. It never went back except for the guys who didn't know any other way to play, like Zutty Singleton is the prime example, or Minor Hall with Kid Ory. They played the way they'd always played and kept doing it. But younger musicians, once they discovered that hi-hat and the ride cymbal, that changed everything.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, it's interesting.
I'm sorry, Nick, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, it's interesting too, if you listen to Freddie Green and how he plays in the 1950s, 1960s, beyond, it's very different than how he played in the 1940s and the 1930s. So even those that kind of held on to the old ways, for lack of a better description, were doing so in a different way, because the rhythm section had changed so much that they had to adapt. I mean, part of Freddie's technique that he's singled out and applauded for is playing these single note and two note chords in the rhythm section as a tenor counter melody to what the bass is playing. But that's partly out of necessity because of the way the bassy rhythm section had evolved by the early 1950s. So like you said, Hal, you couldn't go back, and very few did. You hear some dance records cut in the 1950s. I'm thinking of those records in hi-fi that were made once, the LP kind of took off, and you hear some approximations of it. You hear bits and pieces of it on like Frank Sinatra records from the 1950s. Because Sinatra was a huge swing era fan, and he was somewhat looking back to the 1930s in a lot of ways, but it never quite goes back to what we're listening to now.
And then, I just have to mention that, then also, there's a whole nother chapter to talk about with Milford Graves and Ed Blackwell and Andrew Cyrille and Sonny Murray and many of the great drummers of the 60s and 70s who actually, in some ways, totally eschewed the standard thing that Max Roach and Art Blakey and Kenny Clark had done, and kind of took jazz drumming back in many ways to some of its earlier days, albeit in a very different context. Mm-hmm. So this is fascinating, man. We could just open this up forever. But I have to say, coming out of Benny Goodman's 1935 transcription of "I Was Lucky," this is a hell of a conversation, and I love it, and I love every moment of it, and it's absolutely fascinating. And I think it just underlines the relevance of these recordings, and not only just to to jazz and rhythm section, but to American history and cultural history in so many ways, that we could digress into. Let's go to the last track of this. This is "If I Could Be With You," another classic Fletcher Henderson arrangement that I believe the band is going to record in November 1935. So here we go. Fletcher Henderson to conclude this Gang of Four records.
Very exciting. Another guitar break. So this is the second opportunity we've had to listen to an Alan Roos guitar break. As a reminder, we didn't hear anything from George Van Epps. There are a couple air checks on the Let's Dance broadcasts that feature some Van Epps breaks, but nothing that we heard. So this is really interesting to me as a guitar player and as a guitar historian, in that the Alan Roos guitar break on the studio version of this is pretty well renowned among guitar players. It's held up as a great example of Roos's capabilities and achievements in that George Van Epps derived style. And I heard a couple flubs in there. He didn't quite execute it as cleanly as I'm pretty sure he would have liked to, knowing how great his breaks were. There's some interesting circumstantial evidence about this, in that I think it was in the Soodhalter book, Lost Chords, where Soodhalter interviewed George Van Epps for his book, and Van Epps asserted that he worked with Alan Roos to develop this break for this particular song. George didn't, or perhaps Soodhalter didn't provide much information about when exactly this transpired, so we can only guess, if not, step away from guessing. but it doesn't sound like Alan quite has it together. It's a slightly different approach than he takes on the recorded version. The recorded version is flawless, and it's beautiful, and it's a great example of that chord melody playing and the chord melody soloing approach. So it's great. I love having these instances where we can compare, two exact arrangements with similar instrumental breaks. But otherwise, great playing throughout. Another wave in the air for Harry Goodman, who sounds wonderful on this. And, I'm looking forward to hearing the studio version as a comparison.
Yeah. I should mention the alto solo there was by Toots Mondello. Going back to the Farewell Blues, I didn't mention that on this version the tenor solo was by Dick Clark, but it sounded like on the air check by that point that Art Rollini was playing it. I could be wrong about that, but I think so. Just in terms of mentioning soloists. One thing I'll open up with Hal and talking about Krupa there is to talk about Gene Krupa and Joe Jones for a second. Because one of the things that I noticed in the early on with Joe Jones in that rhythm section is that he's able to interact with his accents at a drop of a dime as to when somebody does something. Something will happen, and within a quarter note, he's at he's there. And as opposed to kind of like what we heard with Sammy Weiss, which is perfectly respectable, wonderful big band drumming from 1934, he has his standard fills he does at the end of an 8-bar thing, and it's good and all that. But it's certainly not in any way seriously integrated in a creative way, I don't think, like with inspiring the soloist and the soloist back to him based on the evidence. And with Krupa there, I really hear, like you mentioned in an earlier track, his rim shots in unusual places. And I think he and Benny had a certain, well, it's not I think, we all know that he and Benny had a certain simpatico that goes back to their first records together in 1930 or so, that they really were just like this. And I heard moments there where Gene really just gets in something that he wouldn't have played unless Benny had played that solo moment at that moment.
Right.
And I think, right, and he doesn't get usually credit for that. That's not something, you talk about Gene Krupa, as we all know, and we all think of Toms and Sing, Sing, Sing,
right,
and all that stuff. But he was so much more.
I think of all the drummers that Benny Goodman had, he was probably the most simpatico and reacted in the best way to what Benny played. A little later, I think Maury Feld did that. I think Sid Catlett did it in between them. But Gene was the king of that, of playing just the right thing to as sort of an accent mark on what Benny had played. And as we've mentioned in an earlier program, where he hit his rim shots on the snare drum sounds totally different than any other drummer. It just had the Gene Krupa sound. I talked with Kevin Dorn, another wonderful drummer, about that, and he said that's one of the Krupa signatures, is when you hear that rim shot, you know it's Gene. And we heard it on that track for sure. He gave us a preview of what's to come in big band drumming, as we just discussed, because he started out on the hi-hat instead of the brushes or the press rolls on the snare drum. He went back to it during the song, and he also played ride cymbal behind Benny. So this is looking forward. It's not the Chicago style that we've heard previously on this session, but everything he played worked exceptionally well on this one, I would say. And again, the rhythm section sounds like one person playing. Doesn't sound like 4 people struggling. We didn't hear much from Frank Froba, and we know from earlier recordings that he's made, just to give him his due, when he made the recordings with the rhythm makers, Jack Bland's rhythm makers in 1932, with Henry Red Allen, Pee Wee Russell, Happy Caldwell, and Zutty Singleton and Pops Foster, he played some wonderful Earl Hines and Zinke Cohn and Alex Hill style Chicago piano with trumpet style single notes in the right hand and broken rhythms where he's playing arpeggios all over the piano and all that. Very, very fine player. He's not getting to do that as much on this session, but we know he's capable of it.
Yeah. What were the sizes of Gene's cymbals? Because I know that they didn't have what we refer to as ride cymbals, which I know you know very well. What were what were the sizes of the cymbals? I don't
probably the hi-hats. Brooks Tegler would know this exactly. I'm having to guess. I would say the hi-hats are probably 12-inch, maybe smaller, because they've got an almost splash cymbal-like sound. They're very thin, probably big cups on the top. That would make a difference in the sound too. The other cymbals, I would guess, are 12 to 14 inches, and they're thin because you hear kind of a washy sound when he's playing the ride cymbal behind Benny, as opposed to the pingy sound that you hear later when drummers use larger cymbals. I remember him talking about, or Gene writing about the cymbals he used in a column in either Metronome or Downbeat, where he said, I just got a 16-inch cymbal that sounds like, how did he put it? Sounds like an armored truck driving through Macy's front window, or something like that.
That's great.
A 16-inch cymbal to us now is like a crash cymbal. But back then, that was a big cymbal. And that would have been kind of a pingy sound, even if it had been thin for a ride cymbal.
Yeah, even when we look at the pictures of Joe Jones of those days, and Chick Webb, I guess, who was one of the last ones who had those suspended cymbals. But yeah, no, that's fascinating. And we should give a shout out here, of course, to the great Brooks Tegler, who has been carrying the Gene Krupa torch for decades, and who, damn him, and Brooks, if you're watching this, get that book out there, because he has such a treasure trove of information, which he shares wonderfully in social media. But every so often he'll say something like, and in my book I have a whole chapter about this. And I say, man, I want to hear it. I want to read it, because there's no scholar of Gene Krupa or certain parts of Benny Goodman's career than Brooks Tegler. I mean, he's just phenomenal with that stuff.
Great.
One other person I wanted to ask you about, who, you've mentioned so many of the great Chicago drummers of that era, but one that we haven't talked about is Lionel Hampton. And, few people remember that Hamp came to fame as Louis Armstrong's drummer. That's how he started in jazz, and before that with Paul Howard's Quality Serenaders, some really wonderful jazz drumming in 1929 and 1930. In your purview, Hal, do you see him as a Chicago drummer?
I've heard him play things that are the Chicago style with Paul Howard and the Quality Serenaders on numbers like Quality Shout and Stuff. He's doing the same kind of techniques that drummers in Chicago were doing of that era. I know one of his influences was Jimmy Bertrand or Jimmy Bertrand, or however you pronounce that, who was known as a show drummer, and he could play anything, read arrangements, he could play hot jazz. Sid Catlett called him the sepia Vic Burton, meaning that he could play anything and make it sound the right way. And he was flashy in being able to twirl his sticks or throw sticks up in the air. I'm sure that's where Lionel Hampton got at least some of that ability, that he had to do that kind of thing. But Bertrand, unfortunately, most of his recordings, he's playing slide whistle or washboard or something other than drums. So it's kind of like Chick Webb. We have to guess, what did he sound like live? There is a recording that came out on Jazz Oracle, label out of Canada, of Eddie South, the great black violinist, had a group that included very young Milt Hinton on string bass.
Oh, yes.
And Jimmy Bertrand on drums. And they did a radio broadcast for a skin treatment called Chiloni Skin Treatment. Mm-hmm. And Jazz Oracle put out this multiple CD set where the band is playing for broadcast. They're playing pop songs of the day, and you can actually hear Jimmy Bertrand playing brushes and press rolls, tempo blocks, articulated choke cymbal, all the stuff that you always wonder, how did he sound if he wasn't playing washboard or slide whistle? There it is. And I can definitely hear his influence on Lionel Hampton.
Yeah.
But the things that Hampton would do when he wasn't putting on a show, where he's just playing like a unaccented 4-beat on the brushes on the snare drum, or playing with a stick under the cymbal, playing triplet figures, things like that. That's real Chicago style.
Because he's on those, Serenade to a Shylock, or Tapping the Commodore.
California, Here I Come.
Right.
California, and Sunday.
Right. Filling in for Souse Dave Tuff, I think, or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, on Tuff's drum set.
Ah, interesting.
They had the drums set up for Dave, and I suspect the drums were set up, and he said, "Hey guys, I'll be back in just a little bit," and didn't come back. That's my guess. Otherwise, Hampton probably would have brought his drum set.
Yeah.
But first time I heard those records, I thought, "Gee, those sound like Tuff's drums." And then I liner notes to some reissue of that mentioned that that was Dave Tuff's drum set. So that explains that.
Just to finish the Lionel Hampton thing, because I don't know whether we'll ever get to 1938 with these records, but when he plays with Goodman, there's a lot of 1938 air checks and studio recordings, and going to 39 of him playing drums with the big band.
Right.
It's so interesting because, for all his showmanship in the trio numbers and with all that stuff that he did, when he plays with the big band, he's transparent. You know what I mean? It's really interesting. He's transparent. You can hear everything in the band, and the occasion goes like to a close kind of hi-hat, and then if it's really getting going, then he'll open up a little bit more. Because I've always wondered, like what he really sounded like with Louis at the Cotton Club in 1930, out in Frank Sebastian's Cotton Club. And, all those stories about how, Louis would play 40 choruses on something, and we hear some of it, on those OK records, I guess. But very interesting, for a guy who on the Vibes liked to fill up every space and do all his stuff, that when he sat down to play big band drums, he was transparent, fascinating. Really,
very different than his small band playing. I think he sometimes overplays, like the things under his own name, where he takes over on drums from whoever had been hired for the session. But the big band drumming's very different, as you say.
Yeah. I'm thinking of Gin for Christmas.
Right.
Was Iggy Elman, one more,
Yeah, right.
He was what a fascinating guy he was. I mean, he could play giants at depths. I mean, he was such a what a great personality. Well, listen, speaking of great personalities, this has been wonderful. Nick and Hal and Loren, we're signing out here. Thanks, guys. We'll be back with yet another Thesaurus session, and thanks, everybody.